Henry H. Neff presents an unabridged recording of The Red Winter, Book 5 of the Tapestry, written and performed by Henry H. Neff. Text copyright 2014 by Random House Children's Books. All rights reserved. Chapter 9. An Oklahoma Girl. David winced as the Moomenhoven's needle passed through his skin. The cut was above his right eye and superficial, albeit bloody. Mystics were being rationed for true emergencies, injuries that could not be treated with needle and thread. He had expended a great deal of energy destroying those two creatures that attacked the flagship, not to mention the pinlegs and those larger scorpion-like horrors. Despite the many questions crowding his mind, he had to overcome an urge to lie down and rest. To take his mind off the pain and his exhaustion, he focused on the hanging lantern that illuminated this dark corner. Its swinging was almost hypnotic, as was the sound of seawater sloshing through the galleon. Plucking at his wrist stump, he listened to someone calling a cadence for those working the pumps. "This ship won't sink," he thought. Battered and flooded but still seaworthy. He wished his certainty extended to other vessels in their fleet. Naiad was certainly destroyed. He had seen her shorn in half, her bowsprit swallowed by a wave. He'd heard others say the same of Andromeda, Norn, Sea Star, and Bellerophon. There would be others, of course, and innumerable casualties. Loss was a funny thing. There was a David Menlo who cared too little, who regarded others' needs and feelings with profound indifference. And there was a David who cared too much, who processed life and loss with a poignancy that threatened to overwhelm him. Balancing the two required tremendous focus, which is why he'd chosen this quiet corner for his treatment. He needed time to think, to regain control. Splash, splash, splash. David did not bother to open his eyes. As the Moomenhoven finished the final stitch, he heard a familiar brogue. "Is the young gentleman recovering?" "I'm fine, Tweedy," said David. "How are you?" "Uninjured," said the hare hoarsely. "Thank you for saving us, Mr. Menlo." "That was my grandfather." "They say you dealt with the two that attacked this ship." "I suppose I did. You're welcome, Tweedy. Any sign of my grandfather?" "Not since he vanished." A curious silence followed. Tweedy never wasted an opportunity to fill a conversational vacuum, to declaim on matters great and small. David opened his eyes. Tweedy was crying. The gruff little hare slumped against a bulkhead, sobbing silently as he hugged his clipboard against his gray-brown belly. Easing off the table, David knelt in the water and stroked the animal's long, trembling ears. "What's wrong, Tweedy?" he asked. I apologize," he stammered. "Shh," said David. "What's wrong? Why did you come to find me?" Wiping a paw across his eyes, the hare straightened and assumed a formal manner. "Mr. Menlo, your presence is required in the director's cabin. Are you fit to walk?" "Yes, I think so." Thanking the Moomenhoven, David followed the hare through the bowels of the vast ship. Mystics, carpenters, and domovoi were hard at work, pumping seawater and repairing the damaged hull. He avoided eye contact, only nodding as people paused from their work to thank him for what he'd done on deck. What had he done? His duty, no more. Pretending it was heroism always made him uncomfortable. He was no more heroic than anyone else who'd done his or her part. His magic was just more powerful. That didn't make him a hero. It simply made him gifted. But gifted or not, he was tired. Bone weary. His chest ached. The scar above his heart burned. It always did when he channeled so much destructive energy. His outlay was a pittance compared to Brahms, but he'd scraped his coffers dry. What David needed was sleep. He prayed his audience with the director would be brief. She'd been unconscious when he'd found her, injured either by a broken spar or one of the larger creatures he'd seen incinerated in her vicinity. Given the chaos on deck, he hadn't had time to inspect her closely. In that split second, he'd seen her breathing. Her only visible wound was a jagged, foot-long splinter that had pierced her upper arm. Given this, his focus and energies had naturally shifted to repelling the attack. Only when it was over did David realize someone had taken Ms. Richter below. Triple the usual number of guards was stationed outside her cabin door. Among them, David recognized several members of the Bloodstone Circle, a cadre of agents second only to the Red Branch. These ones aren't assigned to this ship, thought David. They must have come over from the Typhon. But why? Right now there are a million better uses for them than standing outside a door, even the director's. The guard stood aside as David entered for the second time that evening. Ndidi Awolowo, Ms. Richter's chief advisor, stood in the waiting room, engaged in quiet conversation with two mystics and a wizened Vergar. The Vergar and Miss Awolowo were a study in contrasts. The former was short and squat, with mottled gray skin and eyes like small white pebbles. The latter was tall and regal in colorful robes, an ageless Nigerian beauty with skin like polished horn. Her large, dark eyes fell upon David as he entered. She offered a grandmother's smile, both happy and sad. "There you are," she said. "Thank you, Tweedy. That will be all." "I could stay," volunteered the hare. Miss Awolowo shook her head. "I'm sorry, but there is a protocol to follow." With a dutiful bow, the hare withdrew, and David was left in the waiting room with Miss Awolowo, the Vergar, and the mystics. When Miss Awolowo took his hand, David's unease intensified. What was going on? Where was Miss Richter? The others followed as she led David into the cabin that served as Miss Richter's office. There, he saw Joseph Vincenti, Rowan's retired instructor of devices, and Armand Black, captain of the Bloodstone Circle. Both men were grave as they eyed the table where the director lay. Two Moomenhovens were attending to Miss Richter, their practiced hands anointing her strong but tranquil face with camphor oil. A pastor was sitting in one of the unbroken chairs. He looked wearier than David felt as he perused his Bible, thumbing from page to page in search of a reading. Why was he doing that? The realization struck David like a silent thunderbolt. Ms. Richter was dead. Miss Awolowo was somber but composed. "There will be a time to grieve later," she said. She set a box upon the desk, its top embossed with the Rowan seal. Taking a key from around her neck, Miss Awolowo opened it and removed a large envelope sealed with wax and twined with silvery, glowing cobwebs. She turned to the Vergar. "Orvanger, would you verify that it is intact?" This the Vergar did, inspecting the seal with a jeweler's lens and murmuring words in Old Norse. Pronouncing it sound, he returned the envelope to Miss Awolowo, who promptly opened it with a silver knife. She slid several papers out, found the one she was looking for, and invited the mystics to inspect it. "Would you please attest that this was written by Gabrielle Richter?" Each of the mystics held the paper in turn, their fingers dancing lightly over its surface, as though they were reading Braille. "It is authentic," they confirmed. "Thank you," said Miss Awolowo, taking it from her. "Do Armand Black and Joseph Vincenti concur that the protocols have been followed?" "We do," replied the men in unison. "Very well," said Miss Awolowo, holding the sheet up to the lantern. "These are the succession wishes of Gabrielle Richter, 24th Director of Rowan." The parchment gave off a golden glow. Tears filled David's eyes as Ms. Richter's voice filled the cabin. "I, Gabrielle Dorothy Richter, being of sound mind and body, do hereby name my replacement should death or incapacity prevent me from fulfilling my duties. This is the director's privilege in times of war. While the appointment is temporary, My successor shall assume all powers, privileges, and responsibilities of my office until the council can agree upon a permanent replacement. In the event of my death or incapacity, Rowan's acting director shall be... David shut his eyes. No, someone else. Anyone else. David Menlo. All strength seemed to leave his body. Clutching a nearby table, he slid into a broken chair. Gazing up, he found that all eyes were upon him. The mystics and Vergar were impassive. Vincenti was nodding, but Armand Black merely turned to Miss Awolowo. "Not Brahm?" he asked. "Apparently not," replied Miss Awolowo. "You heard Gabrielle as well as I." Armand Black voiced his objections as though David weren't in the room. "He can't be director. He's still a boy." Miss Awolowo held up a warning finger. "There is nothing in our laws to deny David Menlo's legitimacy as acting director. His age is irrelevant. The choice is Gabrielle's, and that choice is clear." Armand looked to David in appeal. "Surely you see the foolishness in this. Rowan is at war. Our losses in this attack are bad enough. We can't compound them by naming a teenager director. This has nothing to do with your capabilities, Mr. Menlo. It has everything to do with how this would be perceived by enemies and potential allies. And Didi, you would be far more suitable as acting director." Miss Awolowo shook her head. "This is Gabrielle's choice and hers alone. You can voice your objections at a later date. The sole purpose of this gathering is to enact Gabrielle's wishes and invest David with the rights and responsibilities of director." The woman's calm, absolute authority made a profound impression. With a bow, Armand apologized. Clearing his throat, David spoke up. "You're right," he said, addressing Agent Black. "I shouldn't be director." He turned to Miss Awolowo. "Is it possible to decline the appointment? I don't think I'm the person for this job." "That is certainly your privilege," she replied. "But I would like a word before you make any decisions. May I have that word?" "Of course." The others filed out, even the Moomenhovens who arranged Miss Richter's hair and coverlet before scurrying out. When the door closed, David placed a silence charm upon it. No sound would escape the cabin. "How did this happen?" he exclaimed, gesturing in disbelief at Miss Richter's body. His grief was surging to the surface, commandeering any and all emotions. "I saw her on deck. She was unconscious, but nothing like this." "Poison," said Miss Awolowo. "She was wounded by one of those workshop creatures while her attention was on the monsters attacking the ship. A stinger pierced her arm. The toxin worked swiftly. I don't believe she suffered." David reeled. "It wasn't a splinter," he muttered. "Come again." "I saw a splinter," David explained, "stuck in her arm, but it was a stinger. I just left it there." "You were busy saving this ship," said Miss Awolowo pointedly. "You did exactly as Gabrielle would have wanted you to do. You are not responsible for her death." David said nothing. The assessment was kind, but he was not so certain he agreed. The reality, the weight of his predicament came pressing down upon him. He struggled for breath, for the words to form and lead him out of this trap. "Miss Awolowo, I can't be director." "Gabrielle disagrees." "She's mistaken." "I disagree." David gave a helpless sort of laugh. "How can I be director, Miss Awolowo? I was expelled from Rowan." She shrugged, "And deservedly so. You weren't attending your classes and disobeyed a slew of orders. Never was there a more deserving candidate for expulsion. What of it?" "I'm unqualified." The woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "David, no incoming director is qualified when they assume the office. Each must grow into the role. As David considered this, a question nagged at him. How did you know? Know what? That she intended to name me, he said. She told me, replied Miss Awolowo simply. I've always been Gabrielle's confidant, you know. She was younger than I, but she became my closest friend, even my mentor. She had you pegged as a future director when you were a first year. You're joking. Not at all. I even remember the day. It was when she realized you were stealing grimoires from the archives. She debated whether to punish you, and ultimately decided against it. Gabrielle had a keen sense of when to rein someone in and felt that you needed latitude to explore. Mark my words, she'd say, if that boy doesn't blow himself up, he'll be the best director Rowan's ever had. She adored you. David's cheeks flushed hot with shame. I used to think she was stupid, he said quietly. The year I was expelled, when Gravenmere was built, I disagreed with almost everything she did or said. I decided to fight the war alone, to do everything alone. It was only last year that I finally started to understand how complicated her job really was. It's not easy being director. No, said Miss Awolowo, it's not. The demands are great, the problems challenging. You cannot please everyone, and will fail if you try. But Gabrielle had a wonderful system for simplifying problems. Do you know what she'd do? What? She'd make herself a milkshake and walk through the orchards. And on that walk, she'd ask herself a simple question. What would an Oklahoma girl do? I didn't know she was from Oklahoma, David murmured, studying Miss Richter's face. Even in death, it looked assured. Gabrielle was from a tiny town, said Miss Awolowo, even smaller than my village in Nigeria. Her mother was Cherokee, but the rest of her people had been Sooners. She joked she'd always be a frontier gal, a lost little tumbleweed that blew all the way to Rowan. She never forgot her roots. Whenever Rowan's problems threatened to overwhelm her, she took comfort from that question. What would an Oklahoma girl do? As director, the problems she faced were more complex than those she'd faced as a child, but she tackled them the same way, with courage, integrity, and humor. That question kept her grounded amid all the noise and chaos. The milkshakes helped too. David tried to smile. I've never thought of myself as a leader, he said. What if I can't be like her? Miss Awolowo tutted gently. You mustn't try to be. She was Gabrielle Richter. You are David Menlo. You're different people. It's only natural that you will lead in different ways. The old recruiter gave him a shrewd look. There are many kinds of leaders. Too often we confuse a forceful personality with leadership. This is a mistake. Those with different talents and styles can reach the same mountaintop. They just take different paths to get there. David gazed up at her, mindful that his heart was no longer fluttering like a caged and frantic bird. There was nothing magical about the effect she was having on him. The calm she induced was simply an extension of her poise and compassion. You make me feel better, he muttered. Miss Awolowo winked. Why do you think Gabrielle kept me around all these years? There are times when every director needs to vent their frustrations to someone who will simply listen and not judge them. I was that person for Gabrielle. I can be that person for you. David nodded, his insides twisting at a final confession. There may be other reasons I shouldn't be director. Reasons having to do with my heritage. Miss Awolowo raised her eyebrows. David, you do not need to tell me anything you do not wish to. But it may comfort you to know that Gabrielle suspected what I believe is troubling you. I'm not talking about my grandfather." "Neither am I," replied Miss Awolowo. "Don't forget that I recruited you, David. Your powers fairly screamed old magic. As you can imagine, many people were interested in your background. Given your mother's challenges, speculation centered on your father, but there is no mention of a Mr. Menlo." "No," said David, "there wouldn't be. The only things we turned up were records of your heart transplants and the fact that your mother changed her name from Brahms to Menlo." "I did that," said David. "When she was growing up, no one called her Amer. They just said, 'She's Brahms,' like she was branded cattle. Some clerk even recorded that as her official name. It was insulting. When I was 7, I broke about a dozen laws and changed it." "Why did you choose Menlo?" David shrugged. "I liked Thomas Edison. He was the Wizard of Menlo Park, and I thought that was pretty cool. I guess we're lucky I didn't choose Spider-Man." Miss Awolowo smiled. "How could you know what people called your mother when she was young?" she asked. "Amer was born hundreds of years ago. Did she tell you this herself?" David nodded. "In her way." "What way is that?" "My mother's brain is damaged, but she never forgets anything. Sometimes she'll recite things she's heard, whole conversations verbatim. That's how I learned what my father was." David gazed imploringly at the woman. "I can't be director, Miss Awolowo. I can serve Rowan, but I can't lead it. My kind isn't fit." Miss Awolowo frowned. "If I ever hear you say something like that again, I will become angry. Not fit. What nonsense! If you really believe you're destined for evil, why resist? Why make the choices that you have?" David was numb. The fact that he was even having this conversation was mind-boggling. He'd never had this conversation, not even with his grandfather. Brahm knew, of course, but they talked around it. Miss Awolowo beckoned at him. "Say what you are," she urged. That word. David had read it and researched it, but he'd never actually spoken it. He unlocked it from its prison and let it forth, allowing it to squeeze past his lips. "A cambian," he whispered. "Cambian." He'd actually said it. The truth was out in the world, even if it was confined to this cabin. David Menlo was a cambian, the offspring of human and demon. And now Miss Awolowo knew. She might have suspected, but now she knew. The fact that he couldn't take it back was strangely liberating. David blinked, amazed by emotions he was experiencing. Miss Awolowo shrugged. "So, you're a cambian. Am I supposed to recoil?" "If you like." "I'll pass," she said. "With all due respect, however, I must take issue with your definition. A cambian is not what you are." "Then what am I?" asked David. "You are your choices," she replied. "And those choices say that David Menlo is kind, a good friend, a loving son, a wonderful mentor for Mina, a tireless worker, and Rowan's savior many times over. He happens to be blonde, a powerful sorcerer, and a cambian. But these are mere facts. They tell us nothing about David Menlo's character, or what he has chosen to be. Our choices in life define us far more than entries on a birth certificate. You are being asked to make a choice now. You must choose whether to accept Gabrielle's faith and trust in you. Lots of people won't want me to be director." "I've lived a long time," Miss Awolowo sighed. "I have yet to see a leader who enjoyed universal approval. If those are conditions you require, David, you'll be disappointed. Even worse, you might not take risks and become the leader you could be." You assume being a cambian is a handicap, but it bolstered Gabrielle's belief that you were the person for the job. David almost choked. She chose me because I was a cambian? No, said Miss Awolowo firmly. She chose you for the qualities I've already mentioned. However, I think she thought it might help. The world we're living in has changed. Even if we're victorious, even if we topple Prussius, things will never go back to how they were. Those who have reawakened or entered this world are not leaving. If there's to be lasting peace, humans, demons, and other beings must find ways to coexist. A cambian might be the bridge that's needed. How did Miss Richter know I was a cambian? She had suspected from your first year, but her suspicions were confirmed the night we expelled you. David recalled that evening, the knock on his door, and the brief interview with Ms. Richter and Miss Awolowo. He had been in the midst of his experiments, which were highly toxic to demons. Blood petals, he muttered. How did you know they were dangerous to me? I didn't, said Miss Awolowo. It was Gabrielle who noticed the strange red flowers, your gloves, and the sheen of ointment protecting your skin. And then, of course, there was your declining health. She palmed a petal when you weren't looking. Her analysis revealed properties extremely toxic to demons, but harmless to everything else. Blood petals don't even make humans sneeze, but you appear to be having a mild reaction. You're not the first cambian who has tried to hide his nature, David. You were just the best at it. David was astonished. Everything Miss Awolowo said was true. He had saturated his skin with protective salves and slowly built up a tolerance, but experimenting with the petals had still taken a fearsome toll. This conversation was still difficult to process. Miss Richter knew I was a cambian and didn't care. Miss Awolowo knows I'm a cambian and doesn't care. He had spent his entire life hiding the fact. His ceaseless efforts to mask his aura had stunted his growth and even weakened his body to the point his heart had given out. In his mind, his extreme measures had been worth it. He was spared the stigma of being half demon, of being despised by both races. And while demons were stronger than humans in many ways, they had their own vulnerabilities. If others learned David was cambian, there was the possibility he could be summoned, even against his will, if the party learned his true name. While the price was high, his efforts had worked. Not even demons could tell David was a cambian. Only Mina had known right away. And she hadn't cared either. David's entire world was turning upside down. The idea that he might no longer have to hide this aspect of himself was simply staggering. Should I tell my friends? He wondered aloud, thinking of Cynthia Gilly and Max. They were the two people closest to him. What would they think? Miss Awolowo shrugged. That is up to you. But I doubt it will bother the people who are dearest to you. They love you for who you are, not your family tree. Does your grandfather know? He knows what my father was. And does he accept you? David nodded. He walked over to Miss Richter's body and took her hand. She had given him the greatest gift he had ever known, the gift of acceptance. He looked deeply in the director's tranquil face. I'm going to make you proud. Tucking Miss Richter's hand under the coverlet, David turned to Miss Awolowo. I'll do it. Indeed, Awolowo didn't need to be told twice. With a curt nod, she opened the door and called the others back in. 10 minutes later, David swore his oath, and Rowan had a new director. Over the next few hours, the Moomenhovens removed Miss Richter's body to continue the burial preparations, while Mr. Vincenti and others took the lead on tallying and repairing damage from the attack. Meanwhile, Miss Awolowo gave David a crash course on being director. Cases of papers, files, reports, and official correspondence were piled before him. The amount of information was staggering. Updates on Rowan's crops, food stores, civil defense, academic reports, personnel, sanctuary matters, official correspondence. The categories, much less their contents, seemed endless. Fortunately, Miss Awolowo was on hand to make sense of it all. While she gave a brief overview of these and other subjects, she assured him that administrators could tend to these affairs. However, there were matters that required the director's immediate attention. These top-secret files were stored in an inlaid chest without a keyhole or clasp. It would yield only to the director's touch. Removing the documents, David scanned their contents, while other areas of his brain organized the data, analyzed its implications, and constructed patterns. Not even Brahm could match David's capacity to absorb and analyze information. Even so, it was challenging to digest so many revelations and secrets in one sitting. Some files revealed secret locations and passages at Rowan. Others listed suspected traitors, detailed back-channel communications with prominent Brahmas. David learned that Ms. Richter had been corresponding with Queen Lilith, the ruler of Zenuvia, for over a year. A year! There were scrolls from the witch clans and communiques from Dr. Rasmussen, the former chief of the Frankfurt workshop. David's pale, colorless eyes flipped through a dossier concerning Elder Vise that left him speechless. Closing the folder, he rubbed his eyes and stared idly at his cup of lukewarm coffee. "Jacob," he called. Jacob Quills, David's research assistant, came bustling in with a steaming pot of coffee. The domovoi touched a bristly knuckle to his skullcap. "I need you to organize this using our system," said David wearily. "The documents are encrypted, but I've labeled corners. When's the service?" "Tomorrow morning, sir," replied Jacob, setting down the pot. "Miss Awolowo's preparing the eulogy. Rest of the fleet's been informed." David nodded. "What are our losses?" 31 ships, over 11,000 souls, sir. We've sent boats to search for any survivors. Doesn't look good." "Has Mina been told?" "Miss Awolowo plans to inform her once she's finished." "I'll do it," said David. "Would you get me her spy paper? Max's too, while you're at it. The Red Branch dossier is the one by that lantern. Just bring the whole thing." The proper files were found and set upon David's desk, and the domovoi departed. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, David glanced out the windows. It was easy enough to mend broken glass, but this weather was another matter. The panes had nearly frosted over, allowing only a hint of the ruddy red sky beyond. "It's only getting worse. We need to make landfall." The hovering quill acted as David's scribe. It dipped its nib in the glossy ink and set about the spy paper like a hummingbird. "Dear Mina, we were attacked near the straits. Richter is gone, and I am now director. Winter is settling early, and I fear it will be very bad. Rowan must ration everything. If you see my grandfather, tell me immediately. He might not be well. Sol Invictus, David." The ink soaked into the parchment, transmitting the message to little Mina in Tuangrian. He wondered how she was doing. By the time Rowan had set sail, her charge, Ember, had already grown to the size of a moderate python. How fast did dragons grow? He'd have Jacob track down whatever information the archives had. Meanwhile, he needed to reach out to Max. How would Max respond to news of Miss Richter's death? Like David, Max had also fallen in and out of the director's favor, but they had been close, particularly in the weeks leading up to Prusias's siege. Still, Max was in the Red Branch. He'd seen death aplenty. Best to simply tell him. David opened Max's file, found the square of spy paper, and laid the director's decrypting glass upon it. No recent messages. That was odd. Anyone leading a dark matter operation was required to report every 48 hours. Frowning slightly, David reached for Cooper's folder. The agent's latest message was not written in his hand, but Hazel's. "Gabrielle, urgent. Workshop clones tracked Max to Schroep-Hovel. We attempted diversion, but we were unsuccessful. The clones boasted they have a weapon that can kill him. Max was wounded. There was an explosion and we were knocked unconscious. I do not know if Max or Scatha survived. William and I are injured but proceeding across the channel with Toby. William's arms are broken, but I am mending them. He intends to complete his mission and has acquired a contact to help him do so. I will await further instructions from you. Sol Invictus, Hazel. David's weariness vanished. He called sharply for Jacob, who bustled into the cabin looking startled. Yes? I have to do something, said David. I am not to be disturbed unless the fleet comes under attack. But what of Miss Awolowo? David cut him off. Not unless we're under direct attack, Jacob. Understood? Place guards at the door. The domovoi bowed. Yes, Director. When Jacob withdrew, David locked the door with a gesture. Another wave sent the furniture, boxes, cases, and papers to the corners, leaving an open space in the cabin's center. As David stared at it, his pulse began to quicken. While only the most prudish scholars considered shadow walking black magic, all agreed it was dangerous. The feat involved sending one's soul on a journey into Nether, the hazy borderlands between the world of the living and the dead. While shadow walking, one's soul could travel vast distances in a short time, but there were daunting risks. For one, the place was a disorienting landscape in which it was easy to get lost or lose sight of the path that led back to one's body. And one was not alone. There were other travelers in that vaporous murk, other spirits that glided past on errands of their own, or had become lost eons past and gone mad in their fruitless wandering. And finally, Astaroth was known to shadow walk. It was how he often spoke with others without putting his physical form at risk. If David encountered the demon in that realm, things might turn very grim indeed. David had not shadow walked since Walpurgisnacht. He had done so often enough in the months leading up to that fateful night, but never since. The act took a toll on his constitution, and the experience always frightened him. Once he'd become severely disoriented and wandered for hours before regaining his bearings. More than once he'd glimpsed some monstrous silhouette drifting past in the gloom. He wasn't certain which was more terrifying, eternal solitude or nightmarish company. But he was shadow walking tonight. Rowan's director needed to know if 2 Red Branch agents were alive. David Menlo needed to know if his friends needed his help. It was his fault the Atropos possessed a compass that enabled them to track Max. Gathering himself, David inscribed a magic circle and drew the ancient symbols that would enable his spirit to leave his body and slip into the Nether. When all was ready, he knelt within the circle, closed his eyes, and traced the 7 letters of his true name.